1969 contained many historically pivotal events, such as Richard Nixon's presidential inauguration and Rupert Murdoch's purchase of News of the World. The most iconic by far that year, and for many years to come, was the moon landing. Now in 2019, 50 years has passed, and looking back to 1969, the moon landing was, at the time, seen as the first step in what would be a continuing era of space exploration. This did not happen. Despite technological, social, and economic advances in other directions, 1969 proved to be the high point in space exploration.
Without the technological advances of today, the moon landing was extraordinary in the way it utilized the available primitive technology to achieve this conquest. The political motivation for this accomplishment can be traced back to the launch of Sputnik by the USSR in 1957. This sparked a continuing back and forth of space exploration between the US and USSR, commonly referred to as the space race, which would go on to be a key element in the Cold War. The direction of the space race changed in 1962 with the words of John F. Kennedy, when he proclaimed at Rice University that the US would put a man on the moon. From that moment on, the US and USSR's sole focus was to be the first to set foot on the moon.
We now go to our special correspondent, James Price, to discuss the complex political and social context of the Cold War that grew the desire for space exploration.
The Cold War spawned out of the ashes of World War II, as the world's two superpowers, the US and the USSR, sought to establish their distinct political, social, and economic ideals on a world rebuilding itself in the wake of the most devastating war in human history. Space became the newest frontier of this battle, as each side sought to prove the superiority of its technology, its military firepower, and by extension, its political economic system. Its symbolic value cannot be overstated. US military expert Dr. Stephen Adams explains for us the military significance of the space program.
There was much crossover research between intercontinental rocket development and space rocket research. Beyond that, the surveillance and communication capabilities the dominance of an arena such as space could also bring made space an intriguing, worthwhile investment. Because of this intrinsic link, Eisenhower created two national security-oriented space programs that would operate simultaneously with NASA's program, after establishing the program in 1958. The first, spearheaded by the US Air Force, dedicated itself to exploiting the military potential of space. The second, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Air Force, and a new organization called the National Reconnaissance Office, was codenamed Corona.
Politically, the space race was a key test of the strength of public sentiment for efforts to outdo the respective rival power, and ultimately the public's commitment to win. In 1961, US President John F. Kennedy made the bold public claim that the US would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Prior to that announcement, from 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget was increased almost 500%. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's lunar landing program proceeded tentatively, due in no short part to internal debate over its necessity. On that note, let's take an in-depth look at each of the country's programs to understand how the battle was won and lost, as Jack Plummer, our special correspondent, takes us through the timeline of the development of each program.
In 1957, the USSR teed off with the launch of Sputnik 1. This was the first artificial satellite of the Earth. 1 month later, in November 3, the Soviet Union decided space was worthy of life, launching Laika the dog on Sputnik 2. In 1958, the US joined the space race with the first satellite to reach orbit for them, Explorer 1. In 1959, the Russians came back kicking. On January 2, the USSR launched Luna 1, the first man-made object to orbit the Sun. After a year of silence from the Russians, they came back swinging in 1961, launching Yuri Gagarin into space. Yuri became the first man to orbit the Earth, and cosmonaut German Titov became the first man to spend a day in space. In 1965, the Russians came out with a bang, with Alexei Leonov becoming the first man to perform a spacewalk in March 18, spending 12 minutes outside the aircraft. However, the Russians did not beat the Americans to the moon landing. On September 15, the Zond 5 launched, sending 2 turtles to the moon and back. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon, with crewmate Michael Collins.
Ultimately, the space race was a competition between Soviet Russia and the United States to achieve the most in the realm of space travel and become the most important and key part of the competition in the Cold War. It is important not to forget that the space race was a part of the Cold War, not the other way around.
I absolutely can't emphasize that enough.
Yes, the Soviet Union was the first to create a true space program. The Russians wanted to prove that the communist system was capable of achieving important technological developments, as during World War II. They seemed to be behind the rest of the world in technology. The Soviet space program was kept secret until the launch of Sputnik.
The Sputnik satellite was launched on the 4th of October 1957. It was the first man-made object to ever orbit the Earth. It caused tremendous shock and panic in America about the Soviet military threat.
The United States reaction was a rush production of their own rocket to match the Soviet Sputnik. However, the Explorer 1 satellite launch failed to clear the launch tower and exploded.
Quite tragic. After Sputnik, the US government felt impelled to do something of equal caliber.
Thus, they founded a National Aeronautics Space Administration and made a second attempt to launch a satellite on the 31st of July 1958. And this Explorer 1 was the first satellite to detect Van Allen's radiation.
Well done, America. The Sputnik launch shocked people around the world, as most thought the USSR was technologically behind, as they used outdated technology throughout World War II.
Thus, everyone had a low opinion of the communist system. When Russia launched Sputnik, people's opinion of their government and system changed. The successful launch proved the Soviet Union was a true superpower.
US's launch of Explorer 1 was more of a competitive response than an independent achievement. It was the beginning of a long race that would last for decades. The biggest technological influence that the space race had on the Cold War was the development and creation of the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or the ICBM.
The goal was to create a thermonuclear missile that could strike any place on the planet from bases in the USSR.
The creation of the ICBM was the biggest turning point in the Cold War and led to the arms race that is central to the Cold War. The space race primarily affected the Cold War through its technological contributions. It also brought popular support for the space programs in both nations and a newfound patriotism after the horrors of World War II.
This was especially true in the Soviet Union, which is still recovering from the devastation of the German invasion.
The space race was also beneficial to the United States government because it removed attention from the violent aspects of the Cold War. After the Cold War began to die down, the USSR and the US started working together on many projects, one of which was the International Space Station, or ISS. Though there was not as much rivalry as before, rivalry still continues in the nation's collaborative efforts to this day, much reflective of the overall relationship between the two countries as it has been over time. A relationship which caused through rivalry and competitiveness such as an audacious endeavour to ever receive the investment and political and public will for it to be a success. But it wasn't just a desire to outdo each other which inspired the space race. It was also perceived as worthwhile surveillance and communications investment, as we have explored, and also circumstantial links with the rocket development made it all more intriguing.
Thank you for joining us. Good night.